For the past few months, Claire had been pouring herself into our home's transformation. "It's time to modernize," she declared with her trademark enthusiasm. I supported her. After all, she'd always been the creative one in our relationship, with a knack for finding the perfect accent pieces to turn a house into a home. But lately, her passion had come with a price, literally. Our bank statements began showing substantial withdrawals, all labeled under vague descriptions like decor fund or consultation fees. At first, I didn't think much of it. Redecorating wasn't cheap, and Claire had assured me she was being mindful of our finances. It wasn't until last week, when I noticed a $3,000 withdrawal from her personal inheritance account, that something felt off. The inheritance had been her nest egg from her late parents, a topic she treated with a mix of reverence and privacy. Why would she suddenly dip into it for home upgrades? I didn't ask. I trusted Claire implicitly. Or at least, I thought I did. Then came Tuesday night. I was working late in my office, double-checking some accounts for my job as a financial consultant. Claire was out again, her third late-night design consultation this month. She'd started working with a supposed high-end interior designer, one she claimed was helping bring her ideas to life. Curiosity got the better of me. On a whim, I opened our joint account. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but what I found stopped me cold, a $3,000 check made out to Leclerc Jewelers. I stared at the transaction for a long time, the details blurring in my vision. A jewelry store. She hadn't mentioned buying anything for me. No anniversary, no birthday, nothing significant loomed on the horizon. Still, I reasoned with myself. Maybe it was for me. Maybe she was planning a surprise. I almost convinced myself to let it go. Almost. The next morning, while Claire was out, I made a call to the jeweler, posing as her assistant. The clerk on the line was polite and professional, eager to assist. "Yes, the $3,000 purchase," she said, flipping through her records. It was for a custom gold bracelet with an engraving. "Let me see. Ah, yes, here it is, forever yours, D." The word struck like a blow to the chest. My name is Michael. D, the letter burned in my mind. It wasn't me. It couldn't be me. Who the hell was D? For a moment, I sat in stunned silence, the receiver still pressed to my ear as the clerk politely asked if I needed anything else. My body felt heavy, as if gravity had suddenly doubled, pinning me to my seat. "No, that's all," I muttered, hanging up before I betrayed my rising panic. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, replaying every interaction with Claire over the past few months. Her absences. The late-night meetings. The strange evasiveness when I asked about the budget. And now this, proof, or at least a hint, that there was more to the story than redecorating. When Claire came home that night, I greeted her as usual, masking the storm of emotions brewing beneath the surface. "How was the meeting?" I asked, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. She smiled, her face lit with the glow of confidence. "It was good. We made some great progress on the layout for the dining room. I can't wait to show you." I nodded, watching her closely. "Sounds exciting. I'm sure it'll be worth the wait." She kissed my cheek and disappeared upstairs, leaving me standing alone in the living room, staring at the closed door. My gut told me there was something more, a truth hidden beneath her polished explanations. And for the first time in our marriage, I wasn't sure I wanted to hear it. But I knew one thing for certain. I was going to find out. The morning after the call to the jeweler, I couldn't shake the unease. My rational mind warred with my emotions, spinning a web of possibilities. Maybe the engraving had a logical explanation, something I hadn't considered. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. Or maybe it was exactly what it seemed, a betrayal. Claire left early that day, heading to what she claimed was a showroom tour. She kissed me goodbye, her perfume lingering in the air as she disappeared out the door, radiant as always. I watched her car pull away, my heart sinking with every second. I decided it was time to dig deeper. Claire kept meticulous records, which made things easier. She had a habit of leaving her planner on the kitchen counter, its pages filled with appointments, sketches, and to-do lists. I flipped through it, looking for clues. Most entries were harmless, meetings with designers, paint swatches, furniture showings, but then I saw it. Lunch with D, 1 p.m. The date was 2 weeks ago, marked with a heart in the margin. I stared at the tiny symbol, my stomach twisting. Who was D? And why was she meeting them? Determined to get answers, I turned to her laptop, which she'd left charging in the dining room. I hated the idea of snooping, but my instinct screamed at me to press on. After a few tries, I guessed her password, our wedding anniversary. A small part of me hoped the password would lock me out, a sign that she hadn't betrayed me. But it worked, the desktop blinking to life. I started with her emails, scrolling through the inbox for anything unusual. Most were mundane, work correspondence, newsletters, and confirmations from online stores. But then I noticed a thread labeled hotel reservations. I opened it. There it was, a booking confirmation for a weekend stay at the Ridgeview Resort, a luxury getaway just 2 hours from our home. The dates aligned perfectly with one of her recent design conferences. The reservation was for 2 guests. My heart pounded as I read the details, a suite with a private hot tub, champagne on arrival, and a couple's spa package. I felt sick. The name on the reservation made it worse, Claire Daniels. Daniels. D. I sat back, the realization crashing down on me. Whoever this person was, Claire had gone to great lengths to hide them. They were more than a fleeting fling, this was calculated, deliberate. But I wasn't done yet. I opened her messages, searching for anything that might confirm my fears. Sure enough, there were texts exchanged with an unsaved number. The messages were brief, coded almost. Looking forward to Friday. Same spot. Yes. Can't wait. Bring the bracelet. The bracelet. My stomach churned. I couldn't read any more. My hands trembled as I closed the laptop and sat there, staring at the kitchen wall. This was no longer suspicion. It was reality. When Claire returned home that evening, she was glowing, her energy effervescent. She carried a bag of fabric samples, chatting animatedly about potential curtains for the living room. I watched her, feeling a mix of anger and heartbreak. "Everything okay, honey?" she asked, her green eyes locking onto mine. I forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired. Long day." She kissed my forehead, her touch electric, and went upstairs to change. I sat there, numb, staring at the bag she'd left by the door. I couldn't confront her yet, not without more. If Claire was willing to go this far to deceive me, I needed to be prepared. The first thread of our life together had unraveled. Now, I had to decide whether to pull the rest. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of Claire with this mysterious D. The Ridgeview Resort. The bracelet. The lies. It all churned in my mind, a relentless storm of doubt and betrayal. By morning, I knew what I had to do. The first step was simple, I needed more proof. I couldn't confront Claire with just a hotel reservation and a cryptic text thread. She was smart, too smart to admit anything without hard evidence staring her in the face. After she left for another supposed showroom tour, I started my work. I opened her laptop again, but this time, I focused on her location history. Claire wasn't exactly tech-savvy, and she hadn't thought to disable tracking on her devices. I accessed her Google account, where every place she'd been was conveniently logged. Sure enough, the Ridgeview Resort showed up. The dates matched the reservation. But what really caught my attention was a pattern: locations I didn't recognize popping up regularly over the past 3 months, a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, a small park near the river, and a house in a neighborhood I'd never visited. I jotted them all down. The next step was more invasive: her phone. I felt a pang of guilt as I picked it up from the counter, but I told myself it was necessary. Using a cloning app I'd downloaded earlier, I mirrored her phone to mine. This way, I could see her texts, calls, and even her GPS movements in real time. When Claire came home that evening, she was her usual self: warm, cheerful, perfectly Claire. She made dinner while humming to herself, telling me about her plans for the living room. I nodded along, trying to act normal, but inside, I was unraveling. That night, after she fell asleep, I checked my phone. The cloning app had already synced her recent messages. Most were harmless: texts to friends, reminders from work. But there was one new message from that same unsaved number. "Missed you today. Let's make up for it tomorrow. Usual spot at 2 p.m. Her reply was immediate. "Can't wait. I'll be there." I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. The cafe. It had to be the cafe. The next day, I made an excuse to work from home and waited for her to leave. At exactly 1:30 p.m., Claire grabbed her bag, kissed me goodbye, and drove off. I followed her, keeping a safe distance, my heart racing with every turn. She pulled into the cafe parking lot at 1:55 p.m. I parked down the street, out of sight, and watched as she walked inside. She wore the same glow she always did when she was excited, her steps light and confident. Minutes later, a man arrived, a tall, dark-haired guy with a sharp suit and an air of practiced charm. He smiled as he saw her, leaning in for a kiss that she returned without hesitation. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. They took a table by the window, laughing and talking like a couple on their first date. Every now and then, he reached across the table to touch her hand, and she didn't pull away. My stomach churned at the sight. I snapped photos from my car, my hands shaking. This was it, the proof I needed. But watching them, seeing the ease with which she lied to me, cut deeper than I'd expected. When they finally left, I followed them again. They drove to the house from her location history, a modest place in a quiet neighborhood. I parked a block away and waited. An hour passed. Then another. When Claire finally emerged, she looked disheveled but happy, her hair slightly mussed and her cheeks flushed. That night, when she came home, I pretended nothing had happened. She kissed me, her lips still warm, and asked how my day was. "Same old," I replied, my voice calm despite the fire burning inside me. As she turned away, I knew this was only the beginning. I had my proof, but now I needed answers. That evening, I stared at the photos on my phone, my hands trembling. There was no denying it anymore. Claire was having an affair. The man she'd met at the cafe, the man she kissed, laughed with, and disappeared into that house with, was her D. The betrayal was raw and overwhelming, but anger slowly overtook the pain. I wasn't ready to confront her yet. Not until I had a plan. Confronting Claire without leverage would only give her the upper hand. If she had lied this easily, she would have no trouble spinning a story to cover her tracks. No, I needed to think like an accountant. I needed to follow the money. The next day, while Claire was out, I dug deeper into our finances. I started with her inheritance account, the one she'd dipped into for the mysterious bracelet. A few more transactions stood out: a $1,500 charge for a private retreat, a $900 dinner at an exclusive restaurant, and multiple payments to someone listed as DK Interiors. DK Interiors. I googled it, half expecting to find a legitimate design firm. What I found instead was a personal website, minimal, sleek, and suspiciously vague about services offered. The contact page only listed a single name, Daniel Kent. There he was. I clicked through the site, noting the curated images of lavish homes, the promises of personalized attention, and the pretentious tagline, designing more than spaces, creating connections. Connections indeed. Next, I checked her credit card statements. Among the usual charges for groceries and gas, there were glaring anomalies: frequent stays at boutique hotels, purchases from high-end stores, and bookings for experiences that we'd never done together: wine tastings, spa weekends, couples retreats. It painted a clear picture. Claire had been funding a lifestyle for herself and Daniel that I wasn't even part of. But it wasn't just the money. As I pieced together the timeline of her spending, I realized this affair wasn't new. It had been going on for months, maybe even longer. That realization broke something in me. I couldn't keep this to myself anymore, but I still wasn't ready to confront her. Instead, I reached out to someone I trusted, my old college roommate, Dave. He was a lawyer, specializing in family law, and he'd seen his fair share of messy divorces. When I called, he didn't hesitate. "Come to my office," he said. "Bring everything you've got." An hour later, I sat across from Dave in his downtown office. I showed him the photos, the messages, and the financial records. He listened intently, his face hardening as the evidence piled up. "This is bad," Dave finally said, leaning back in his chair. "She's not just cheating, Michael. She's using your shared assets to bankroll this guy." I nodded, my jaw tight. "What do I do?" "You need to document everything, every charge, every meeting, every text. Keep gathering evidence, but do it quietly. If she finds out you're onto her, she'll try to cover her tracks." I nodded, taking mental notes as he spoke. "And one more thing," Dave added, his voice low. "You need to protect yourself financially. Freeze any joint accounts and set up one in your name. If she's been draining your savings, you need to stop the bleeding." His words made my stomach churn. It felt like preparing for battle against the person I'd trusted most in the world. But I couldn't let my emotions cloud my judgment. Claire had already betrayed me. I couldn't let her destroy me too. As I left Dave's office, I felt a strange sense of resolve. I didn't know how this would end, but I knew one thing: I wouldn't let Claire win. That night, I watched her closely as she chatted about her day, her smile radiant as always. It was chilling how normal she seemed, as if nothing was wrong. But now, I saw her for what she really was: a liar, a manipulator, and a stranger wearing the face of my wife. I smiled back, playing my part. For now, the game continued. But soon, I would make my move. Over the next week, I became a detective in my own marriage. Every smile, every touch, every casual remark from Claire felt like a performance I had to decode. I knew she was lying, but I still didn't know the full scope of her betrayal. The nights were the hardest. Lying in bed next to her, pretending everything was fine, while my mind raced with questions. Who was this Daniel Kent, really? What was his endgame? Did he love her, or was she just another mark? I couldn't stop until I had the answers. The first breakthrough came when I revisited Claire's location history. That house she'd visited with Daniel, the one tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, it wasn't just a random rendezvous spot. With some sleuthing, I discovered it was listed under Daniel Kent's name. The address led me to more information. Daniel wasn't just a designer, he had a history. Public records revealed he'd declared bankruptcy 5 years ago and had multiple failed business ventures. There were court filings from angry investors and even a few lawsuits from past clients who accused him of fraud. It was clear, Daniel wasn't some innocent lover swept up in an affair. He was a grifter. The realization hit me like a freight train. Claire hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, she'd put our finances, our future, in the hands of a con artist. I started staking out the house. It felt absurd, sitting in my car like some B-movie private eye, but it was necessary. The first evening, I saw Claire's car pull into the driveway at 6:15 p.m. She stayed for 3 hours. When she left, Daniel walked her to her car, kissed her deeply, and handed her a small, velvet box. The next day, I had a camera ready. I snapped photos of her arriving, leaving, and the intimate moments they shared. It was surreal to see my wife through the lens like this, an actress in someone else's love story. I didn't stop there. Using the cloning app on her phone, I intercepted a series of messages between her and Daniel. "Claire, I can't wait for our weekend getaway. Everything's booked. Daniel, you're amazing. I'm so lucky to have you. Don't forget the second payment, it's due Friday." Second payment? For what? The pieces started falling into place. Daniel wasn't just using her for companionship. He was draining her financially, and by extension, draining me. Armed with the messages, I revisited our bank accounts. Sure enough, there were new charges I hadn't noticed before, a $4,000 transfer to a private account, labeled simply as consultation fees. It didn't take a genius to figure out who it was going to. By the end of my investigation, the numbers were staggering. Claire had spent over $20,000 on Daniel in the past 6 months. Between the jewelry, the hotel stays, and the mysterious payments, she had siphoned off a significant chunk of our savings. And she thought I didn't notice. One night, as Claire showered, I accessed her laptop again. This time, I searched for anything related to the second payment. In her email, I found a contract, poorly written but damning nonetheless. It was an agreement between Claire and Daniel for exclusive design services, complete with a payment schedule. The contract was a sham. It was just a front for his scam, a way to justify the money he was taking from her. That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The evidence was overwhelming. I had the photos, the messages, the financial records, and now the contract. But the question loomed, what was my next move? I could confront her, but what good would that do? I needed to think bigger, to ensure that when this house of cards collapsed, Claire and Daniel were the ones left picking up the pieces. For now, I stayed silent, biding my time. The truth was a loaded weapon, and I wasn't ready to fire just yet. I was reaching my breaking point, but I kept up the charade. Every morning, Claire kissed me goodbye, promising her love, and I'd watch her drive off to meet Daniel. Every night, she returned home, pretending nothing was amiss. It was nauseating, but I had to endure it a little longer. The more I watched her, the more I noticed the cracks in her act. She was distracted, forgetting little details, like what day we had dinner with friends or the groceries she promised to pick up. Once, she even called me Danny in passing, quickly laughing it off as a slip of the tongue. I didn't laugh. The following weekend, she told me she was heading out of town for a design expo. By now, I knew better. I nodded, kissed her goodbye, and waited until she was gone before packing my own bag. I knew where she was going, thanks to her location history and the reservation details I'd intercepted, a luxury cabin nestled in the mountains. I followed her, staying far enough behind to avoid detection. It felt surreal, tailing my wife like some more detective, but this was my reality now. She arrived at the cabin just before sunset. Daniel was already there, waiting on the porch with a glass of wine in hand. Claire's face lit up when she saw him, the way it used to light up for me. He pulled her into a kiss, and they disappeared inside. I parked my car down the road, out of sight, and walked closer. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by dense trees, but I managed to find a vantage point through a gap in the foliage. Inside, they were laughing, sharing a meal by the fireplace, their intimacy on full display. It was like watching strangers, people I didn't recognize playing a version of the life I thought I had. I took photos, though it felt like I was documenting my own humiliation. Every embrace, every kiss, every laugh, I captured it all. If this was going to end, it was going to end on my terms, and I needed the evidence to make sure of that. As the night wore on, I saw them toast with champagne, Claire leaning in to whisper something in Daniel's ear. He laughed, pulling her closer. I didn't need to hear the words to know what they were about. I stayed until the lights went out, my hands numb from the cold and my heart from the betrayal. Driving home, I rehearsed what I would say when I confronted her, how I would lay everything out, each lie, each transaction, each stolen moment. But when I walked into our house, the weight of it all hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't ready yet. Instead, I sent the photos to Dave. His response came quickly, "This changes everything. Meet me tomorrow." The next morning, as Claire returned home with the same glowing smile, I acted normal. She kissed me on the cheek, asked how my weekend was, and pretended she hadn't spent the past 2 days with another man. I nodded along, biting back the anger that threatened to boil over. Soon, I told myself. Soon, she'd know what it felt like to be blindsided. For now, the game continued. But I was no longer playing to keep the peace. I was playing to win. The following day, I met Dave at his office, a sleek space with towering windows that overlooked the city. He had the photos I'd sent spread across his desk, along with a growing stack of evidence I'd been compiling over the past few weeks. "Michael," he began, gesturing for me to sit, "this is more than enough to blow the lid off her entire scheme. The financial misuse alone would put her in hot water during divorce proceedings, not to mention the blatant infidelity." I nodded, my jaw tight. "I don't want just a clean divorce, Dave. I want her to feel the consequences of this. She's spent months lying to me, stealing from me, and funding this guy's lifestyle. I won't let her walk away unscathed." Dave leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. "We have options. Freezing the accounts was a smart move, it'll stop her from funneling more money to Daniel. Next, we can serve her divorce papers with an immediate restraining order on the joint assets. It'll put her on the defensive." "What about Daniel?" I asked. "He's not just some fling. He's a con artist. There has to be a way to expose him too." Dave's expression turned calculating. "We'll dig into his background further, but from what you found, we already have leverage. His shady business dealings, his ties to Claire's spending, it's all a liability for him. We could approach the authorities, especially if there's evidence of fraud. But for now, let's focus on Claire. She's the key to dismantling this." I left Dave's office with a new sense of resolve. The anger that had been simmering inside me was now laser-focused. I wasn't just ending this marriage, I was going to take control of my life back. That evening, I returned home and waited for Claire. She came in just after 7 p.m., a takeaway bag in one hand and her phone in the other. "Dinner's on me tonight," she said cheerfully, placing the bag on the counter. "Thanks," I replied, forcing a smile. "How was your day?" "Oh, busy," she said, rummaging through the cabinets for plates. "Meetings, errands. You know how it is." I leaned against the counter, watching her. The ease with which she lied was staggering. But tonight, I wasn't going to play along. "I talked to Dave today," I said casually. She froze for a split second, then recovered. "Dave? Your lawyer friend? What for?" "Oh, just some financial planning," I said, taking a slow sip of water. "You know, making sure our assets are protected." Her smile faltered, just slightly. "That's smart." I nodded, setting the glass down. "It's important to know where all the money is going. Like those recent transactions from the joint account." Her hand tightened on the plate she was holding. "I told you, those were for the house. Redecorating costs." "Right," I said, locking eyes with her. "And the $4,000 to Daniel Kent? Was that for the house too?" The color drained from her face. For a moment, she looked like a deer caught in headlights. "Michael," she began, her voice shaky, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't, I interrupted, my voice firm. Don't lie to me again, Claire. I know everything. The hotels, the jewelry, the weekends with him. I know where the money went, and I know who Daniel Kent really is. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. I've been patient, I continued, my tone cold. I've watched you come home every night and pretend that nothing's wrong while you've been draining our savings and making me a fool. But it stops now. Michael, Save it, I snapped. You can explain yourself to my lawyer. As of tomorrow, I'm filing for divorce, and you can deal with the fallout. Oh, and by the way, I added, pulling out my phone, I've sent all the evidence to the bank and the authorities. If you think Daniel's going to save you, you're in for a rude awakening. Her face crumpled, the confident mask she always wore shattering. Michael, please. I didn't mean for it to go this far. He manipulated me. I laughed bitterly. Manipulated you? No, Claire. You made your choices. And now you'll have to live with them. I left her standing there, stunned and silent. For the first time in months, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The game was over. The silence that followed was deafening. Claire stood frozen in the kitchen, her face pale and her lips trembling. I wanted to feel triumphant, vindicated even, but all I felt was exhaustion. This wasn't a victory, it was the inevitable conclusion to months of deception. She finally spoke, her voice weak. Michael, we can fix this. I'll stop seeing him. No, I interrupted, my tone ice cold. You don't get to rewrite the rules now. You didn't just betray me, Claire. You put our entire future at risk, for him. She stepped closer, her hands shaking. It was a mistake. I was lost, and he made me feel. Don't, I said sharply, holding up a hand. Don't you dare try to justify this. I saw the bills, Claire. The hotels, the jewelry, the bracelet. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. Her composure cracked, tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't mean to hurt you, she whispered, her voice breaking. You didn't mean to hurt me. I laughed bitterly, the sound hollow. You spent months lying to my face, stealing from me, funding his life while I was here, working, trusting you. Don't insult me with excuses. I turned and walked toward the door, grabbing my coat. Where are you going? She asked, panic lacing her voice. Anywhere but here, I replied, not looking back. I left the house, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. I didn't have a destination in mind, just the overwhelming need to escape the suffocating weight of her betrayal. I ended up at a small diner on the edge of town, one of those places that's open 24 hours and serves terrible coffee. Sitting in a booth by the window, I stared at my phone. The messages from Dave were still there, a reminder of the next steps I needed to take. Everything is in place. The papers will be served tomorrow. I should have felt relief, but all I felt was hollow. The waitress brought me coffee, her kind smile a stark contrast to the chaos in my head. Rough night? She asked gently. You could say that, I muttered, staring into the cup. She nodded knowingly but didn't press further. It was a kindness I didn't deserve, but I was grateful for it nonetheless. As I sat there, the reality of what I'd done began to sink in. This wasn't just about Claire anymore. This was about dismantling the life we'd built together, every memory, every plan, every promise. I thought about the Claire I used to know, the woman I fell in love with, and wondered if she had ever really existed. When I finally returned home, it was nearly midnight. The house was dark, except for a single light in the living room. Claire was sitting on the couch, her face red and blotchy from crying. She looked up as I entered, her eyes pleading. Michael, please. Can we just talk? I shook my head, my voice firm. There's nothing left to say, Claire. Tomorrow, you'll get the papers. From here on out, it's business. Her face crumpled again, but I didn't care. I walked upstairs to the guest room, locking the door behind me. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of finality settle over me. There was no going back. The life I thought I had was gone, and all that was left was the wreckage. Tomorrow, everything would change. The morning arrived with a grim sense of purpose. I woke early, not out of eagerness, but because the weight of what was coming made sleep impossible. I heard Claire moving around downstairs. Her footsteps were hesitant, almost like she was trying not to disturb me, a sharp contrast to her usual confident strides. By the time I came down, she was seated at the dining table, clutching a mug of coffee like it was her lifeline. Her eyes were swollen and red, and the air between us felt thick with everything unsaid. "Good morning," she said quietly, her voice breaking slightly. I didn't respond. I grabbed my own coffee and sat across from her, deliberately keeping the table as a barrier between us. "Michael," she began, her voice trembling, "I know you're angry. I know I hurt you. But can we try to work through this? Please?" I looked at her, feeling more detached than I ever thought possible. "Work through what, Claire? The months of lies? The money you stole? The fact that you've been sleeping with another man?" Her face crumpled at my words, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I was stupid," she whispered. "I got caught up in something that wasn't real. I know I messed up, but I still love you. I swear, I do." "Love?" I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh even to my own ears. "You don't get to throw that word around like it means something. If you loved me, Claire, you wouldn't have done any of this." She opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of the doorbell cut her off. I stood up, my heart pounding. I knew exactly who it was. Claire's eyes followed me as I walked to the door. When I opened it, a uniformed process server stood there, a manila envelope in hand. "Michael Carter?" he asked. "That's me," I replied. "Here you go," he said, handing over the envelope. "Consider her served." Claire had risen from her chair, her face pale as she stared at the envelope in my hands. "What's that?" she asked, though I knew she already knew the answer. I walked back to the table and dropped the envelope in front of her. "Divorce papers," I said flatly. "Effective immediately." Her hands trembled as she picked up the envelope, opening it with agonizing slowness. As she read through the documents, her face shifted from shock to despair. "Michael," she said, looking up at me with tears streaming down her face. "You don't have to do this. We can fix this. We can go to therapy, anything, please, just don't end it like this." I shook my head, my voice cold and resolute. "It's already ended, Claire. You ended it the moment you decided he was worth more to you than me." She stood, desperate now, reaching for me. "He doesn't matter, Michael. I was wrong. I'll do anything to make it up to you." I stepped back, her touch feeling foreign, almost repulsive. "It's too late," I said. "You made your choice, and now I'm making mine." She collapsed into the chair, sobbing, her hands clutching the papers like they could somehow undo the damage. I didn't stay to watch. I grabbed my coat and walked out the door, leaving her alone with the consequences of her actions. As I drove away, a strange mix of emotions coursed through me, relief, anger, sadness. But above all, there was a sense of finality. Claire had been the center of my world for over a decade, but now, that world was gone. All that remained was the promise of something new, something better. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. The house was quiet when I returned that evening. The eerie stillness was a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed my life in recent weeks. Claire's car was in the driveway, but the lights inside were dim. I braced myself, unsure of what I'd find. She was sitting on the couch in the living room, a glass of wine in hand, staring at nothing. The divorce papers were spread out on the coffee table in front of her, along with a tissue box that looked like it had been emptied. She looked up as I entered, her eyes hollow. "You're really going through with this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," I replied firmly. Claire took a shaky breath, setting the wine glass down. "I never wanted it to end this way," she said, her voice cracking. "I never stopped loving you." I shook my head, anger and sadness warring inside me. "You don't betray someone you love, Claire. You don't lie to them, steal from them, humiliate them." She flinched but didn't argue. Instead, she leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small. I sat down in the chair across from her, keeping the space between us. "You'll move out," I said bluntly. "I'll keep the house. The lawyers will finalize the division of assets. After that, we'll go our separate ways." She nodded slowly, tears slipping down her cheeks. "And Daniel?" "Daniel?" I scoffed. "I sent everything to the authorities, Claire, his scams, his shady finances, the fake contracts. They'll deal with him. And if you're smart, you'll stay as far away from him as possible." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. For a moment, I almost felt pity for her. Almost. But then I remembered the lies, the betrayal, the months I'd spent wondering what had gone wrong while she lived a double life. "I didn't mean to ruin everything," she said through her tears. "I was stupid, Michael. Reckless. But I never stopped loving you. I need you to know that." I stood, unable to listen anymore. "It doesn't matter anymore, Claire. Love isn't enough, not after everything you've done." She looked up at me, her face a mask of heartbreak. "Do you think you'll ever forgive me?" I paused, considering her question. "Maybe one day," I said honestly. "But not now. Not anytime soon." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'll start packing tomorrow." I turned to leave, but before I reached the door, I stopped and looked back. "I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Claire." But it wasn't here, and it wasn't with me. With that, I walked out, the door closing softly behind me. As I drove away, the weight of the past few weeks began to lift. It wasn't joy or relief, exactly, but a quiet sense of liberation. The life I'd known was over, but that meant there was space for something new, something better. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again.